Good morning, everybody. This is our usual Friday morning Bridges of Meaning question and answer session. A couple of notes before we begin. I have to quit at 11:30, so we can only go an hour and a half today. I'm doing a conversation with Vervaeke and some other people about, I'm not even sure what we're talking about, but I just have to show up. So I have that at noon, so I'll need a little bit of buffer time between this and that. Also, next week, I don't know yet whether or not I can do this. The Superior Court of Sacramento, in its wisdom, has decided to call me into service, potential service, as a juror. So I have jury duty next week. And what that means in Sacramento is I have this little number, and every day I have to check to see whether or not I actually have to go in. Sometimes you don't have to. Last time I had it, I didn't have to go in at all. This time, you just never know. So what that means is that for this next week, I have zero control over my schedule. So I might have lots of time to make videos, and I might have zero time to make videos. So I'm not scheduling things, because what I do have to do on my jury duty week is continue my day job. So I'll be making sermons and those kinds of things. So I have no idea what next week is going to look like, and that's just the way jury duty goes. So next week, if I know towards the end of the week that I will be able to do this, I'll probably put the little notification screen up on YouTube. Otherwise, don't plan on it. So later next week, I'll be able to tell you whether or not, maybe. So that's just the deal with jury duty. Well, let's jump into the questions. Rick and I got the audio stuff figured out, so we can, in fact, once again discuss live within the Discord. If there are questions I'll work it this way. If there are questions in the YouTube chat that someone within the Discord wants to have addressed, pull it in, cut and paste it into the PVK Q&A list, and that way it'll be included. So those of you putting questions into the live chat in YouTube, you're going to have to make your question so good that you motivate someone within the estuary to pull you in from the deep blue sea into our little mix of salty and fresh. So that'll be the rule today. All right. PK Josh has the first question this morning. Hi, Paul. I'd love for you to address Jordan Peterson and the Spirit of Antichrist, spoken of in 1 John 4, 1 through 3. I will read it. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of Antichrist, of which you have heard that is coming and now is already in the world. Little children, you are from God and have conquered them. For the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. They are from the world. Therefore, what they said is from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us, and whoever is not God, who is not from God, does not listen to us. From this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. That is 1 John 4, 1 through 6. A text without a context is a pretext for saying whatever the heck you want. There's a little tidbit of wisdom for biblical interpretation. The book of 1 John is a very interesting book. Biblical scholars aren't quite sure how to categorize the book because it doesn't seem to be a letter. 2 John and 3 John are both clearly epistles, and they're written to specific contexts addressing certain things. Some people think that the letter of 1 John is an addendum to the Gospel of John because in other words, Gnosticism has gotten so conflicted, because certain readings in Christianity had gotten so docetic. What do I mean by docetic? I mean that they've gotten overly spiritual. You've heard me say many times, if you've been watching my videos lately, that one of the Bible is about the reunion of heaven and earth, okay? And Jesus Christ is the perfect union of heaven and earth. And what happens in the resurrection is new heavens and new earth completely brought into line, into sync. One of the things that we are continually doing in the world, now lately I've been talking about the upper register, I'll put it in front of the camera a little better, the upper register and the lower register. The upper register is mind, spirit. The lower register is matter, flesh. The upper register is heaven. The lower register is earth. And one of the things that we struggle with all the time is getting the two registers in proper order. Humanity is the breath of heaven and the stuff of earth, the breath of God and the stuff of earth. Jesus, the Lord's Prayer and the Gospel of Matthew, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Mathieu Pageau's book is all about, oh, it's not right here, is all about heaven and earth. That is, and this thing can map just all over the place, okay? So the Gospel of John is a very different gospel than the synoptics in that it approaches the story of Jesus in a very different way. It is, if you've got this duality, and again, this is later I saw a question about God number 3. If you ask me about God number 3, I know that you don't quite understand what I'm talking about with God number 1 and God number 2, because it's all about these dualities. And it's not different gods, it's different views of God. So with these dualities, we get confused, or rather different sides overreach for human beings. And often we overreach on the upper register. And the Greeks were quite famous for that. They would depreciate the lower register being earth. And so in Greek culture, for example, people who worked with their hands were of less value than people who worked with their minds. And that continues into our culture to a degree today. The Hebrews had a god who got his hands dirty. That's not very Greek, but it is terrifically Hebrew. And so you have this union of heaven and earth, this continual binding of heaven and earth. I wrote a Substack today based on continued reflection from the 3-hour video I posted yesterday about story. And story really sort of starts in the upper register because it's word-based and it's immaterial. You can destroy a book that a story is in, but you don't destroy the story. That's how you know that it's upper register. And so what happens in creation is that things reverberate. They go back and forth between heaven and earth, back and forth between heaven and earth. And that's a healthy, virtuous cycle. If you have a system that stays up high and never gets down to the lower register, I mean, Christians have talked this way about all sorts of things in the past. We'd say that someone is so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. That's sort of a way of saying the same thing. Everything's just stuck up here in the upper register. So part of what happened in certain communities that were deeply influenced by Greek thought, they had no trouble believing Jesus was a god because of the miracles he did, but they would reject the idea that Jesus was human. Okay? Now, in our materialist culture, we have the exact opposite problem. All over the place, you will find people that says Jesus was a man, Jesus was a man. Jesus was just a man. Jesus was a man who had amazing thoughts. Jesus was a spiritual man, because they don't really think about what they mean by that word spiritual, yada, yada, yada. But Jesus is God? No, I can't believe that. So part of what happened with the Gospel of John, because John appropriated a lot of these thoughts, I mean, the logos and the prologue of the Gospel of John, is the assumption is that people who were sort of docetic in their imagination, upper register, didn't believe that Jesus was a human being, because no God worth his salt would become flesh. For the same reason, they denied the resurrection of Jesus, because what would be the point of once again entering down into materiality, which is subject to change and decay, when perfection, which is immateriality, not subject to change and decay, was available to you? And that's the impetus behind the things that today we call the Gnostic Gospels. And so, for example, in the Gospel of Judas, Judas is the hero because he released Jesus from the prison of his body. You can find all these kinds of ideas in certain forms of Platonism. And a few weeks ago, when I was preaching about when I was in First Thessalonians, I'll be in Second Thessalonians this week. When I was in First Thessalonians, N.T. Wright, in The Resurrection of the Son of God, has a really nice section about how for Greeks, Homer was their Old Testament and Plato was their New Testament. So the Gospel of John goes out and it's heard within Greek cultures. Now, it's quite likely that the Johannine community is in Ephesus. And now Ephesus is in that part of what today is Turkey, which was Greek. That's where Troy was. That west coast of Turkey was all sort of part of the Aegean Greco community, until, of course, the Persians kicked them out of Turkey and then, tried to get into Greece. So if you understand the history of that, so it's quite likely that the Johannine community is battling docetic ideas. Now, I could use the word Gnostic ideas, but that in terms of scholarship has become so conflicted right now. What do we mean by that word Gnostic? Well, in sort of low resolution layman's terms, we mean docetic, prioritizing the upper register at the expense of the lower register. All right. First John is an astoundingly binary book. So for all the nuance in the Gospel of John, if in fact First John is a letter to address misreadings of the Gospel of John, which it might be, it's not a letter, it's just kind of an addendum. It's definitely addressing people who had been coming into the church but hadn't fully addressed this Greek cultural habit. And so what seemed to be developing is this idea that Jesus was sort of a spiritual being who might look material and might act material, but wasn't truly human. When you get into Trinitarian theology and Christology, the declaration, all of these declarations, all these creedal declarations about who Jesus is, really addresses this 1 and 2, this above and below, these upper and lower registers. It really it says, here it is. It's got to be, Jesus has to be fully God and fully man, because if Jesus is cheating on one side or the other, you're going to lose the connection between heaven and earth. And you're not actually going to have the good creation that the Hebrews believe we have. So if you read these 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, these are rough books, because basically you get the image that you have these tiny little communities, and some of these people have left these communities. And whereas right now, when you have churches that are sort of splitting up, church Christians are like, well, you want to affirm, yada, yada, yada. You can go ahead and leave our denomination. We're not going to kick you on the way out, yada, yada. We're real nice about that. Not 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Those books are clearly addressing people who had come into the community and had been trying to promote a very ascetic version of the gospel. And the community, John, the apostle, however you want to work through that whole range of issues, was having none of it. They were having none of it. And so these people leaving them, they're Antichrist. Well, why are they Antichrist? Well, again, I said these books are very binary. They're all yes or no. So this morning, there was this hilarious, I'll pull it up here, and Rick can grab my screen if he wants to. There was there's this hilarious meme. It got all kinds of, I can pull it up here. Here it is. There's this hilarious meme of Jordan Peterson, how it started, clean your room, and Jonathan Pageau, how it's going. Obviously, Zeus exists. I mean, just a hilarious meme. And there were some responses to Pageau, which were to the point of, oh, if you believe in Zeus, you're of the devil, stuff like that. One of the things that I really have to be careful with is, and almost always the best response to certain types of reactions to something that you do is no reaction. You really have to weigh how you get into those feeding frenzies. But I understand that reaction to what Pageau said. It's a very binary reaction. And one of the important things to remember is that the binary and the nuance have to live in the same universe. And so part of, in Pageauian terms, not reaping the field all the way to the edges, leaving the fringe, is not always either destroying the binary or destroying the nuance. Leave the binary and the nuance alone, because they both have their place. There's both yes, no, and there's both more, less. And there have to be both. There's always both. So don't try to destroy them. And so what we see in the culture is that some people are always binary and some people are always nuance. And what you have to do is figure out when to be binary and when to be nuance. Because if you're always one and never the other, then you're not really understanding, or you're not really engaging the world with wisdom. Okay? So 1 John is very binary. People who don't believe that Jesus came in the flesh, that God became human, they're Antichrist. Now that's a perfect formulation, because Christ is all about, look at what the Apostle Paul says, we are in Christ. Christ is all about the reunion of heaven and earth. Christ is all about our union with him and our participation in his resurrection. And by Christ, we travel from life through death into resurrection, into renewed flesh, into the age to come. Heaven and earth are properly met. That is the story of the Bible. So that's how you should understand 1 John 4 and Antichrist. Now, Because it's framed as Antichrist, people grab onto that. If they're doing any kind of binary game, and well, no matter what you say, if it doesn't measure up to whatever yardstick they have, they're going to label you as Antichrist. And that's why I began saying a proof text without a context is a pretext for error. So what is 1 John 4 about? It's about this question of Christology. Is Jesus the perfect union of heaven and earth? Yes. If you short some of your Christology, are you Antichrist? Yes. All right. Now, Jordan Peterson and the Spirit of Antichrist. I don't, Jordan Peterson, because of where we are in the recession of modernity, because of Jordan's strange modernistic manner. Again, look at the video that I posted about Jordan's prayer and Jordan's recent statement about Justin Trudeau and Hans-Georg Mueller's response to Jordan Peterson. I continue to maintain that the best biblical analogy for Jordan Peterson is the unauthorized exorcist of the Gospel of Mark. Why do I say that? Because the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is a manifestation of mass exorcism. Oh, that sounds so dramatic. Yeah, well, it's pastors. We wield drama. That's the job of a pastor. We wield words, we wield stories, we wield drama. The Jordan Peterson phenomenon is a great example of mass exorcism because he has dislodged spirits. What are spirits? Well, watch my video on Pageau. We are spiritual creatures. We create spirit. We create school spirit. We create a family has a spirit. A conversation has a spirit. This video will have a spirit by the time it's done. We are spiritually active creatures. Now, again, with our rather binary materialist emphasizing the lower register world, people will hear that and say, well, he's just totally deontologized the spiritual world. Oh, by no means. Spirits, there are spirits far before and beyond humanity. That seems true. That there seems to be abundant evidence for that. People always want to talk about evidence, and then they shut the door on all sorts of evidence. That's why all the evidence people I sort of laugh at, because the world has way too much evidence. That's the whole point of combinatorial explosiveness. We're drowning in evidence. So Jordan Peterson has exercised segment of a generation with respect to spirits that have held them in bondage. Now, why do I use the unauthorized exorcist of the Gospel of Mark? And that comes out of this story where Jesus and his disciples find a guy who's out there using the name of Jesus, but he's not part of their group. And so the disciples of Jesus want to enforce their intellectual property. We have trademarked Jesus' name because we are part of Jesus' group. And here's this guy over there casting out spirits in Jesus' name, but he's not part of our group. Should we go rough him up? Should we go threaten to, it would be a shame if something would happen to your family? Should we do that, Jesus? Jesus says, you do not understand. how we are or how we win or how we conquer. Jesus says, leave him alone. Because he can't in one minute exercise in my name and then turn around and slander me. Whatever your assessment, to whatever degree you can do it, of Jordan Peterson's standing with God, which I would assert you can't do. You can't see into his heart. You only know him through this crazy little video universe we're all dealing in. Is there plenty of error? Jonathan Pageau, who's a personal friend of his, I'm not. Jonathan Pageau, who's a personal friend of his, repeatedly has called him a heretic. Of course, he's not an Orthodox Christian. You push Pageau, he might call me a heretic because I'm not an big O Orthodox Christian. I believe I'm a small O Orthodox Christian. So you have to understand all of the nuance of the terms. And so I don't see Jordan Peterson committing the error that is specifically addressed by the first epistle of John, noting Antichrist. Now, does that mean Antichrist, that term should be limited to only those who are docetic and undermining the humanity of Christ? No, it's a word that's generally used for enemies of the gospel. I don't see Jordan Peterson as an enemy of the gospel. I think I see Jordan Peterson as a seeker. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's this whole seeker movement that went through the evangelical church from the 1980s to the 2000s. And Jordan Peterson is in many ways a seeker. He is looking for truth. He is wrestling with it. And the conversation he had with Jonathan Pageau and many of the conversations he's had with Christian clergy. Well, how many clergy has he talked to? He's talked to Bishop Barron. Hasn't had too many conversations with clergy. But he's wrestling, he's seeking, he's looking. But he is in many ways the unauthorized exorcist. He's not, was he baptized into the United Church of Canada? I'd be curious to know that, because he was or he wasn't. And I'm sure whoever's keeping the records of the little church in was it Fairview or Farview? Farview, Alberta, knows, because it'll be in there, whether little baby Jordan Peterson, whether Jordan Peterson's parents brought him up for baptism, I don't know. So I don't know whether or not he's baptized. And baptism is a big deal. But is he currently in the Christian Reformed Church? We have this thing called public profession of faith, that, well, you're baptized. It's sort of analogous to confirmation in the Roman Catholic Church. He's not, to my knowledge. Oh, thank you. Rick on the run. Thanks for the super chats. So that's where he stands. So I wouldn't call him Antichrist at all. And I think it's important, if people are going to be out there wielding this term Antichrist. Oh, the Antichrist, it's found in 1 John 4. Okay, well, what's the context of 1 John 4? Because right now, you're actually fairly hard-pressed to find a lot of docetics around, because we're far more swimming in materialists who will say, well, Jesus was a human being, but he wasn't fully God. Okay, so, but that's the context of that, of keeping heaven and earth in proper orientation. And in fact, that's the Christian life, because you're called to be a Christian, which means you're called to be like Christ in the perfect meeting of heaven and earth. That's the goal. And then we become in Christ, which is the meeting of heaven and earth, which is why the resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth are the fulfillment of the story. So let's see. Yeah, 30 minutes, and we have a shorter Q&A today, so I better keep going. If you had one wish, what would it be? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's easy. Sounds like a dodge, but every other wish is subsumed in that wish. What is your take on the Christian justification for war? Now, as noted before, I'm not a pacifist. There are lots of different kinds of pacifists. You know, some Anabaptists believe Christians should not in any way participate in any in war. They should not be soldiers. If you're a really consistent pacifist, I suppose you shouldn't be a police officer. So, but I'm not an Anabaptist, I'm Reformed. And what I mean by that is that there are times and places when war might be inevitable or even necessary. And because of that, and especially in the wake of World War II, so if you know a little bit of 20th century history, there was this whole peace movement before the First World War. And in fact, after the First World War, that peace movement tried to find expression in trying to make Germany unable to engage in war again. The irony of that effort made war inevitable, which was the Second World War. In many ways, the First and the Second World War were just two halves of the same war. So, and I actually look at that as in sort of in the light of Pageau's, you know, don't harvest to the end of the field, keep a margin. War is on that margin. And we're not going to eliminate it in this dispensation. We're just not going to do it. And what that means is Christians will at times need to participate in armies and governments and all of that. So for Christians to look at some ethical guidelines with respect to those things, I think is a good thing. So I'm by no means an expert in, there's an entire discipline looking at the just war theory and all of that stuff. And I think it's important and necessary. So again, I'm Reformed. I'm not Anabaptist, and that's one of the differences. Hey, Paul, I remember C.S. Lewis writing that the default religion of mankind is pantheism, but Carl Jung thought it would be more like Gnosticism. Well, there's a difference between Jung and Lewis. A lot of pantheists are sort of Gnostic-y, and that actually gets into, so I read through the questions already, and that's part of the reason I gave the long one at first, so that some of these other questions, just go back and think about the categories I used to answer the question about Jordan Peterson and Antichrist. So David Bentley Hart, who's, you know, there's a big element of fandom about David Bentley Hart. This morning I was just listening to Nate Heil and Jess's conversation with each other, and they were talking about David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament. And then they talked about, oh, you know, Paul is doing Romans, and, you know, and he's streaming those. Have you listened to those? No. And it's like, well, David Bentley Hart's a really smart guy. He really is. And he and I might any two people disagree about some things, but so David Hart's a really smart guy, and I haven't. There's just too many interesting people out there to be an expert on everyone. So, but David Bentley Hart, somehow I got a comped version of David Bentley Hart's Substack attributed to me, which I don't know anything about that. But so suddenly in my email thread, I start seeing David Bentley Hart Substacks. And then he had a big series on Gnosticism, and I didn't read all of it, but I read some of it. It was really good. So there's a huge debate right now about, and you'll hear about the definition of Gnosticism and what we mean by that term, and whether we're being fair to the history with that term. And you heard some of that from John Vervaeke. So, and Jung is an astoundingly difficult thinker. And I, by no means, you know, I've read a little bit of Jung, but it's hard to understand. Most of the Jung I know anything about either comes through Jordan Peterson, or some of you who have sent me a lot of Jungian stuff or corrected me on some aspects of Jung in the comment section, or guys like Skip, who has his whole channel on Jung, and the I forget the Europeans over there who have their channel on Jung that Pageau was just on. So I can't really make assessments about these things. Lewis, I know a lot more about, and I think Lewis is correct in that it's psychedelics can pretty easily make you a pantheist from what I've seen. And I think that holds up to the idea that, so James Frazee who has a comment here, a question here. Because what psychedelics seem to do is sort of take it's using Ian McGilchrist, it sort of takes the left brain offline, and then suddenly everything is connected. Everything is connected. And of course, everything is connected. But just because everything is connected doesn't mean that everything is the same. So it would then stand to reason that there'd be a strong relationship between religion in general and pantheism, and that it's sort of an endemic overreaction to the upper register. So I guess that'd be my answer to that. I really don't know enough about Jung. And then people are like, well, you should spend the next few months reading a lot of Jung. Yeah, and I should spend the next few months reading a lot of about 24 names on a list of that I've risen up since I've started this crazy YouTube odyssey. So I'll let other people who know more about that answer better than I. What do you mean by spiritual? So Chad the alcoholic broke down this morning. His Dodge Caravan broke down, and he was sitting by the side of the highway, and he was, it's all on video. You can find it on the Bridges of Meaning or one of his channels. And so he's sitting by the side of the highway and waiting for the AAA and talking about the wisdom of his wife, because ever since he got married, his wife made him get AAA, and he's used it like 3 times. I got to warn you, Chad, like in most AAA accounts, you only get like 4 calls. So you might be up to the limit, which kind of made me smile because it just made me think about Bachelor Chad sitting by the side of the highway, cursing himself and then overpaying for tow service. But anyway, so married Chad was sitting by the side of the highway waiting for the AAA guy to come and trying to answer this question about what do you mean by spiritual. And I thought it was a pretty good answer you gave, Chad. I was listening to that while I emptied the dishwasher. The perennial force asked a question. Okay. It's in Discord. Okay, good. So what do I mean by spiritual? I'll use the John 3 answer. Spirit is what moves matter. That's spiritual. Spirit moves matter. But spirit moves matter, and that's the relationship between the two. And that definition is implicit in almost everybody continuing to use that word spirit. And it's an astounding thing. And for those of us who would like to help this world understand this world a little bit better, that's like a back door that remains built into the system. Because you have ardent materialists talking about spiritual, and they think they're talking about feelings. Not just feelings. So that's what spirit is. Jesus basically gives the definition in John 3. So James Frazee, can you go over the pros and cons of home churches as an alternative to traditional brick and mortar Protestant churches? Home churches can be really powerful, meaningful ways of doing church with your family. It's sort of like the difference between having a personal trainer and just deciding you're going to stay in shape on your own. You can, if you have enough drive and self-discipline, well, it's even worse than that. Deciding you're not only going to stay in shape on your own, you're going to help you and a dozen of the people who mean more to you, who live around you and mean the most to you in your world, help all of them stay in shape too. The house church takes on that ambitious goal. And if you manage to do it, you will have grown and your people will have grown. And what I mean by do it is stick with it for more than a few months at a time. Because it's really difficult to keep a home church going well over a long period of time, especially in a context like ours, which has all of this differentiation and professionalization. If you want to run a home church, you have all of the challenges of a pastor and quite a bit fewer of the advantages. So part of what happened in, let's say, small group Bible studies is that they were in some ways deprofessionalized. We're going to have inductive Bible study. We're all going to go around the room and we're going to read a Bible verse and we're going to ask each other what you thought of it. You know what? A group of people off the street, what they thought of a Bible verse, on one hand, it's all over the map, and on the other hand, it can be mind-numbingly boring because hardly any of them know anything about the book that they're reading. And most of what they bring to the book is sort of a pastiche of lessons they learned in Sunday school and Christian memes or folk religious ideas that they've sort of attached themselves to. It's similar to that Tony Robbins comment I made about the Tony Robbins thing on YouTube, where he basically has someone who stand up in this room full of 600 people and explain the meaning of life. And it sounds like all of the normal stuff you would draw out of any spiritualish zeitgeist community today. In other words, it's sort of a least common denominator, very fuzzy appropriation of what's happening now. And for this reason, churches have done things like established seminaries to maybe, just maybe, often with a lot of failure, at least maybe have the pastor know a little bit more about the Bible than all of the hobby horses of Protestantism for the last 500 years. Maybe. Often we don't get beyond that. So to do a home church means you not only have to figure that out, but if children are involved, you're going to have to figure out how to do that with children too, which is another huge thing, which churches sort of try to figure out too. And again, not always very well. It's analogous to homeschooling, but homeschooling is far easier. So I've done all of this. When I do a house church type thing, it's sort of like having one of your buddies with your pickup basketball game having played at the top level of college basketball. He can make everybody's game better, but it's sort of cheating and it's not really a pickup game. So when they work, House churches are one of the best kinds of church you can imagine, but they're really demanding. And most of the time, it's not working real well unless the people really, really work at it. So, and then like during the late 90s, early 2000s, there's this whole cell church movement. And one of the churches in Sacramento we started planting that way. And so they emphasized, it was sort of a hybrid. It was like, we're going to try to take the best of an established institutional church and the best of a house church and put them together. And that was sort of the cell church model. So you would train your house church leaders. You would support them. Maybe every 3 months you would have a combined service so you could get some of the lift of a bigger group of people and the professionalism. And so the idea behind the cell church was to try to leverage the upsides of the institutional and mitigate the downsides of the house church and put it all together. And for the most part, very few churches manage to really pull off the cell church, because another one of the difficulties that you face is institutional church and sort of the advantages, but also laziness of institutional churches is so deep in our culture. So our church plant started all of their little cells, and the pastors were all excited about their cells because they saw the spiritual formations. They saw this intense Christian formation and spiritual disciplines, and they're doing it all right. They're doing that all in the local churches, and the pastors were all excited about the fruit that they were seeing and the development that they were seeing. And then when they would actually shut up and listen to the people in the cell churches were like, we understand that these small groups are sort of a launch phase for our future mega church. We just want to know when real church is going to start. And the pastors just kept going like this, because the pastors just kept talking this orthodoxy of house church and cell church, and none of it could get through the cultural filter. So I love house churches and I love house churching, but it's really demanding and it's high effort, and people very seldom manage to pull it off. People can pull off homeschooling at a far higher level than they can pull off home churching. Now, if you lived in another place in the world where there weren't quite so many churches available and church culture wasn't so deep, or if you're living under a repressive regime like an Islamic country or a communist country, then your house churches were really going to go because of the overall environment. But in America, it's sort of like having a mom and pop store. Everybody in the neighborhood really loves the mom and pop store, but is it really going to be sustained at that level? So that's kind of my answer to that. Justice from Portland. Hi, Paul. I'd like to ask Pastor this question. So I'll ask you, are you always pastoring? For example, are you pastor at the grocery store, when you're at a meeting with a friend or a lunch, or serving jury duty? I told Rick this question and I said, like, I can refine that question. Are you pastoring when you're making love to your wife? Pastor is an office. Now, I hope I'm always a Christian, but pastor is a specific office. And so then Rick said, and forget exactly what Rick said. Rick said something about, are you always a, what did you say, Rick? A network operator, or see how low resolution hearing is? Rick and I haven't figured out our Benny Jesuit hand signs yet. So you're not always pastoring because it's an office. It's an office of the church. And sometimes, especially, like sometimes my wife does not want me to be a pastor, but to be her husband. There's another office. There's another role. Sometimes I shouldn't be a pastor to my children. I should be their father. So pastor is something that it's an office that you sometimes have to take on and take off. Now, that's rather low resolution. About a week ago, I talked about the fact that ever since the 70s, clergy have sort of dressed in street clothes so we can sort of be subversive, so we can pop up and be instant pastor in a surprising way, sort of like in the Matrix movie, one of those, like Agent Smith can just pop into another character, like the agents can just pop into a character in the Matrix. And it's part of the reason we're wearing street clothes. That's one strategy. Another strategy is in a parish, priests or clergy would wear clerical collars all the time. And therefore, they are, now, I use the word parish there, and that's critical. That's very much a Christendom establishment. So if everybody imagines they're living in a parish and I walk out with a clerical collar, well, now we're engaging in a different drama, and that drama has a tremendous amount of value. So there are lots and lots and lots of layers to this question. So it's a really hard question. So I would have to say that Christian is more essential to me than pastor. And there's a Protestant layer to that answer too, because a Protestant pastor is different. Protestant minister, that word even elicits the tensions more. A Protestant minister is different from a Catholic or Orthodox priest. Those are different worlds. Now, the fact that right now we're inhabiting the same city just shows the incredible diversity and complexity of the Western world right now. So this question touches on lots of stuff. So my best answer would be no. I'm not always a pastor. I can sort of become a pastor out in public fairly regularly. But that's sort of like in the Matrix, an agent taking over a body and whoop, now I'm in a different role. But I role change a lot. Sometimes I'm a father, sometimes I'm a husband, sometimes a pastor. Right now, oh wow, you guys are just giving Rick the exercise. Lance and the prophet Zacharias, thank you both. Question submitted. I better keep moving. Only have a half hour left. So good question. And a good question leads to wisdom. I'll say it that way. So it's a good question. Hey, Paul. I recall watching a couple of your videos covering him, so I thought I'd ask if you would give your opinion of the Distributist. How familiar are with him and his content, and how would you assess him overall? Is he especially good or bad person, or pretty typical? I have met the Distributist. The Distributist came to one of our meetups. He lives in the Sacramento area. And I've spoken with him a couple of times, and I really enjoy him. His channel is fairly political, but that makes sense if you understand his personal journey from secularism to the brand of Catholicism that he has embraced. I don't know a lot about Chestertonian. I don't even know how to say it properly. But I know that Mary Cohen is sort of one, and the Distributist is one. And, I enjoyed meeting him in person. I've enjoyed my conversations with him. I've probably only watched a dozen or so of his videos, but I have grown and been blessed by them. So, hey, I'll, if he shoots me an email, I'll answer. And if he stops by my church, we'll sit down and have a chat. And for the best of my knowledge, he's a brother in Christ. So now he's got a lot of fairly specific political ideas that goes along with his overall story and even his conversion experience to the particular type of Roman Catholic he has become and how he puts the world together. So some people won't like him because of his politics. My take is everybody gets to have a worldview and everybody gets to have political opinions. That's sort of the deal in a secular liberal democracy. And some of his opinions are a pretty strong critique of secular liberal democracy. So the system that shields him is a system that he, wishes would evolve into something a bit more Roman Catholic. These really deep questions are difficult in terms of how should politics arrange the world? In the medieval period, the arrangement of religion and politics was radically different than it is today. The American experiment in secularism is a world-changing experiment. And for the most part, it succeeded if you imagine success is colonizing the rest of the systems. Now, I suspect it is deeply joined with modernity. And so as we see modernity recede, we're going to see some of the benefits of liberal democracy recede. And it's really scary to know what comes after that, because a lot of what came before that was pretty bloody. So this is some pretty big stuff, but we're not going to avoid these conversations by avoiding each other. So no, I like the Distributist. I've met him in person. A lot of the videos that he's watched, I've really grown by. His story that he tells sometimes in some of them, his personal story about how he became a Christian and how that transformation has occurred in him. It's very inspiring. So I like him, but that isn't not knowing where you come from. It's hard to know if that answer is helpful. So you also have to appreciate the fact that I'm a person that's really high in openness, combined with a Calvinism that is also high in openness, which confuses a lot of people because a lot of the Calvinists that are on the internet are pretty low in openness and pretty binary. And so when they hear that I'm a Calvinist, they don't quite know what to think. Or they say, you're not a real Calvinist. John Piper's a real Calvinist, not you. Oh, okay. And a lot of people look at someone like Marilyn Robinson and say, you're not a real Calvinist. Well, Marilyn Robinson's a pretty smart woman, and she says she's a Calvinist. So this is a complicated world. So there's a few thoughts. Can you explain what a lay preacher is? A lay preacher is someone who has not had the kind of training that a professional minister is. That's really the distinction. The distinction is that's a distinction in Protestant. That's a distinction in Protestant liberal America. That distinction comes out of, in some ways, the Protestant Reformation. In the Protestant Reformation, Luther didn't quite know all that he was unraveling, because he starts pulling on some strings, and some people took those strings and really ran with it. So today, just vernacularly, in the vernacular, the definition is between a professional and someone who's not professional. Now, you can have a professional plumber who has a truck with an incorporation and a license and is bonded and all of those things. They're a professional plumber. And you can have a lay plumber. Lay plumber isn't bonded. Lay plumber isn't incorporated. Now, the lay plumber might be a better plumber than the professional plumber. That kind of thing happens all the time. But it has to do with credentialing, structures, organization, etc. Oh boy, the questions keep coming. No more questions today. Up. See who's faster typist. No more questions from November 12. Thank you. Exercise is on the exorcism. Exercise is an exorcism. It is sort of. Grim Griz on his Mirror video this morning talked about doing yoga. And I just had the most amazing vision of Grim Griz strolling into a yoga studio like you have all over Sacramento, California, that's filled with skinny, beautiful young women wearing Lululemon yoga pants, and Griz showing up in some gym shorts and a dirty t-shirt and having a cigarette dangling out of his mouth and having them say, "You can't take that cigarette in here." That was such a fun vision I had of Grim Griz doing yoga. Hilarious. Anyway, back to the questions. Oh boy, there's lots of them. Oh, I got to really keep going. Okay, Andre. Oh, that I already did that one. Are you familiar with the work of Dennis MacDonald? No. Specifically, his work on the Gospel of John's intertextuality with the guy of Euripides. No, that was a quick one. I have no idea. Question. All from Grim Griz. Because Grim Griz isn't in the Bridges of Meaning Discord. If assigned a Jesus and the Money Changer sermon, what would you want the congregation to take away? That the Calvinist cadets that I participated in used to sell light bulbs in church. No. I think the heart of, oh gosh, I hate these do exegesis on the fly things, because it's sort of like asking an opera singer to sing pop. But because there's a lot of, I wind up preaching on certain texts of the Bible are connected with certain liturgical days that come up every year. So you wind up preaching on them a ton. And part of the difficulty of being a pastor who has to, you know, unlike, let's say, someone in perhaps a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox church who doesn't have to do much sermonizing on something like this or come up with a new angle or try and make the text fresh for them again. For Protestants, there's some real tension in there. What's happening with Jesus with the triumphal entry is an apocalyptic confrontation between Jesus and all of the lazy assumptions that have grown up into his world. Most of what Jesus does physically that's recorded in the Bible, the miracles, the driving out the money changers, are enacted parables demonstrating something about the message that Jesus is trying to give. Now, some of the different synoptics highlight different aspects of these depending on their framing of it. And so I think a big part of it is the inclusion of the Gentiles, which, when you think about that and what the money changers were doing, the money changers were facilitating diaspora Jews' participation in the sacrifice of the temple. That's what the money changers are doing. So in some ways, it's a very inclusive vision. But Jesus disrupting that is an element that is very much in keeping with Jesus cursing the fig tree. Because basically what he's saying through that is the old order of diaspora and the relationship between the diaspora and the localized temple. Jesus is going to destroy that order. And in fact, Jesus is going to multiply himself through his church, instantiated in his church throughout the empire. That's what that text that's what that text is pointing to. That no longer, it's sort of I think the fulfillment of synagogue worship. It's the culmination of synagogue worship. Because the temple is going away, and it did go away. And so what Jesus is saying is, all my body is going to be distributed wherever 2 or 3 gather. So that's in house churches or mega churches and everything in between. Is your reading on Luke 18:19, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Why would Jesus challenge someone calling him good? Ooh, there's tricks in this question. It's very typical of the kinds of layers that Jesus challenged people with. There's sort of a surface layer to that. Like, why do you call me good? Nobody's good except God. Are you calling me God? It's not unlike Jesus. Jesus engages people like this all the time. It's part of the reason he's always fresh. Because just when you expose one layer, you see the next layer. Then you pull that up and you see another layer. And you just keep going down. There's no bottom to Jesus. That's why he's God. And that's all built into that question. 22 minutes. Can principalities, powers, demons, etc. only work through humans? No. They can move the physical world. They mostly work through humans. But according to Jesus, when he casts legion into a herd of swine and they throw themselves in the sea, they can move swine. They can move a swine through a herd. And the herd aspect to that text is not unimportant. We individualists always think like, oh, each pig gets a demon. When you look at what happened in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, there's a demon in a group. Politics can be demonic. So no, but can they move matter without us? Yes. I have no question about that. I've seen too much. I've heard too many credible people tell me stories to believe that basically what happened in the West was a lab leak. In the lab, you say, we're going to limit our scientific experiments. We're going to take purpose out and we're going to limit it to observation. That's a perfect thing to do in a science lab. But that idea leaked out into the world. And then some people are like, there are no spirits beyond human beings. All spirits are derived from human beings. It's a stupid idea. It doesn't hold up to evidence. Now, if you put blinders on and say, I'm not going to acknowledge any agency that can't be explained, well, then you've just put blinders on. You've just framed the world, and the world is going to appear as it does through that frame. But the vast majority of human beings in the world today, and those who have lived throughout history, don't believe that at all. So, Lance Cleaver, we have recently having a conversation about whether most folks would recognize Jesus if he was on earth communicating with us today. My thinking is most of us would not, including Christians to their surprise. Just like saints, we prefer them dead because they undo us, right? That's the Substack. Yeah, that was basically one of the Substacks I wrote this week. I've been pretty active in my Substack lately. A lot of people rightly complain, Paul, I can't keep up with your videos. You put out too many videos and I can't keep up with them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Some of you out there have jobs that afford, almost necessitate a ton of content to listen to. And to you, I'm your friend because I put out a ton of content. Many of you can't possibly listen to everything I'm putting out. And that's a challenge for me. How do I address that challenge? I sometimes just have fun on Twitter. Sometimes it's just shit posting. Sometimes it's being trollish. But one of the things that I usually do in the morning when I wake up, I check to see if the video to be released did get released. And then I will sit down and I will think about the video that I made before and I posted that day, and I'll try to summarize it. And I'll post that summary on Twitter because Twitter keeps me brief. And then I will copy and paste those tweets into my Substack. So if you're not on Twitter, but you want to get video summaries, subscribe to my Substack. I have not monetized my Substack. If you subscribe to my Substack right now, you'll get all of them free. Will I someday monetize my Substack? Maybe. I don't know. Depends a lot on a lot of other things. But for now, Substack is a really easy way for me to not only harvest some of the ideas from my videos, but also put them in a very efficient, readable format so that if you want to sort of keep up with my thinking, if you subscribe to my Substack, you can keep up with my thinking, but you're just going to get little summaries and tidbits. And for those of you who like to go along for the ride, well, what I put out 6-7 hours of videos this week. That's kind of my normal output. So, or maybe closer to 10. So I try to have it on different levels because not all of you have 10 hours to listen to me every week. Whether you should or not, there's a whole nother question. But yeah, so you basically made my point, Lance. Also, I would put my money on Griswold Grim recognizing him before the vast majority of professing Christians. It could very well be. Could very well be. Contemplate what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount about reputation. Again, this is just so Jesus. There's all these, let your light shine before men. And then don't do your righteousness before men to be praised by men. It's almost everything Jesus says just requires us to dig and dig and dig and dig. And if you dig, you will gain wisdom. The evidence is when Jesus showed up, we killed him. That's the evidence. And the same with saints. Can I attribute the Agent and Arenic to you and Vervaeke in my essay on perennial philosophy? Yes. After Pageau's conversation with Hatke and your commentary, I'm starting to question the conceptualization of Jesus as archetype. Archetypos. Deconstruct archetype into the Greek and continue thinking about it. There are a couple of reasons. One is that I see Pageau struggling to defend that position against Hatke's point. Another is that the particulars of the story make the position hard to defend. You've kind of lost me. A third is the fact that the Gospels tell a specific story and are not an abstraction. Right. You should read my Substack that I released today on this, because my thinking is a little different than Pageau's. The realer the story, an archetype is an abstraction. And so I know people didn't necessarily like what Andrew Clavin said about science fiction, but I think he had a point. And I think the point is it's really difficult to do compelling characters in an imaginary world. It's easier to do compelling characters in a world more like we know. I mean, Clavin doesn't write characters in imaginary worlds because we know the texture and the contextuality of this world. The fourth is the appropriation of Mueller's humorous mention of Wittgenstein's exploding book argument. A perfect instantiation of anything, which might be definition of an archetype, makes every other instantiation of that meaningless, which is basically Hatke's problem. Do you agree? Is it better to view Jesus as the top of a hierarchy of manifestation or an archetype instead of the archetype itself? Okay, this is a great question, really. Compare Jesus in the Gospels with Jesus in Revelation 1. Jesus in Revelation 1 is very archetypal. He's standing. If you read Revelation 1, Jesus has a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and his face shines like the sun, and his body is like burnished bronze, and he's holding stars and candlesticks. Artists have attempted to draw that verbal description many times, and it's almost always a fail. I think that's Clavin's point. You can't draw it because you can't translate it into when you, this is also sort of a Protestant point about iconography. When you instantiate it, it does lose something, but it also gains something. Abstractions are they're way up here. Instantiations are down here. The power comes in the meeting of the two. This is part of the, oh gosh, another video I was almost made this week is about people's loving the infallibility of natural law, which is analogous to the infallibility of Scripture and papal infallibility. And you have to get your mind around what infallibility attempts to do to understand why we're playing with those concepts. It's a really complex question, Richard, and it's an excellent question, but I don't know if I can get it all in. But it's a really good question. And read today's Substack, because I think I answer it in the Substack today. Maybe I should just pull the darn thing up.
Can you also do some work reminding me what the Greek derivative is, like what arche to first means? I've heard it before, but I forget.
Sure. So arche is this powerful Greek term which means first and foremost. And that is so the arche is the ruler. He's also this is where this whole conundrum of biblical headship comes from. Because the first thing, everything beyond the first is a derivative. So there are two ways of understanding the world. One is that of corruption. And ancient people believed that first things, ancient things, were always better than any subsequent things. In other words, things are all downhill from there. Christianity introduces progress. And that tends us to imagine that first things are primitive things and everything is uphill from there. Now, both of these ideas are true. But like many true things, it's the application of the true thing where all the power lies. So arche is first and foremost, and tupos is type or example. And so when in the book of Revelation, Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, you actually have the merging of traditionalism, which believes first things are best and everything is corruption, and progressivism, which says that things reach their culmination and their height. Jesus is Alpha and Omega. He's beginning and the end. He's the arche and he's the telos. And this is why Pageau keeps talking about Jesus filling the hierarchy. He's both things. He's all in all. So the anxiety that I heard Hatke having is that once we express a story as being definitive, we think that takes all the air out of the room, when in fact it's quite the opposite. A definitive story defines and allows new instantiations of the story. And the Mueller's idea, which is a powerful one, of an absolute would destroy everything else, doesn't understand the power of God that Andrew Crouch writes about in his book Playing God. Because what's clear about God's power is that God's power affords the flourishing of the world. It doesn't suck the air out. Lewis talks about that in Screwtape Letters, where the Father above wants sons to grow up to be like him. That's Lewis basically expressing what everybody gets excited about in terms of theosis. The Father below in Screwtape Letters sucks everything out of everything so it can all be about him, sort of the kernel of narcissism. So, but these are huge and important concepts, way more than I can address in the 8 minutes I have left. So it's my best shot. All right. See, the prophet Zechariah asked a $25 question. Is he going to get his money's worth? Boy, I don't know. Does Calvinism take any theological position on the 7 deadly sins? You will find Calvinist ministers preaching on the 7 deadly sins fairly often. But this sort of characterization of sins that developed, Calvinism is way too young to have developed a lot of that, and also in different cultures. Also, Calvinism tends to, is sin an act, or is sin a motivation, or is sin a quality? Now, all three can be, but people will often emphasize one over against another. So whenever you see people talking about sins, well, that's a sin. Well, that's a sin. Well, the other things are sins. Events are sins. Acts are sins. But when Calvinists talk about things like total depravity, it means something like mark missing is endemic amongst humanity. We all miss the mark. We regularly miss the mark. Even the best shot I take will miss the mark in some ways. So I have done 7 Deadly Sins sermon series. So what happens often is, so when the seeker movement went through, really I probably should do some reflecting on the relationship between the meaning crisis and the seeker movement in church, because one of the things that happened in the seeker movement is that if you're looking at Bill Hybels or Rick Warren, almost all their preaching wound up being on like Proverbs, because all their preaching was wisdom, because the goal of the seeker service was to impress the world with the wisdom of the church and to use that to then motivate people to make the religious move of joining the church and committing to its discipline. So in many ways, the seeker movement that really held sway from the 80s to the 2000s and is still very much with churches today, especially mega churches. The seeker movement was very much a movement about meaning and wisdom. So, and in that you would often get sermons on 7 deadly sins. because, but that also is an example of topical preaching. And so in my tradition, in the Christian Reformed Church, topical preaching, you won't get disciplined for topical preaching, but you will lose status in some Christian Reformed Church hierarchies because we believe in expository preaching more. And that gets into the question of what is a church for? And, you know, anybody who looks at my Sunday work will see, well, gosh, Paul, you do a ton of teaching. Yeah. Teaching is really big in Protestant churches. And that's a different emphasis than what you're going to find in a Roman Catholic worship service or an Orthodox service. And again, there's a ton of history in those differences. It's kind of where things are. All right. What do you think of Neoplatonic Christian, Kabbalistic, and Suffic interpretation that see the original Bible as the world? In other words, Word of God, man's Bible's a map. I don't think I know enough about any of those things to probably really get into that. FSCK, you've just been the dude of the dude of super chats today. So thank you. Here's my lay tithe for your answer to me. You're very welcome. And another $2 from ABC. All right. Let's see, what time is it? 3 minutes. All right, y'all in Discord land, we've got 3 minutes for foolishness. What do you want to talk about in 3 minutes? Oh, Andre, that's your username. Well, thank you, Andre. Appreciate it.
Some of us were saying that you need to go on Sam Adams' channel and discuss the Trinity with him.
Sam, oh gosh. Oh, well, actually, in some ways I'm working up to it because you will notice the more I work on this stuff, the better I understand why Trinitarian confessionality became as it did. You know, even in my example of Christ being fully human and fully God, I understand historically a lot of the questions that Sam raises, and they're good questions and challenges. But I also think in terms of theology, Christian theology, why did Trinitarianism win? I don't think that's accidental. So maybe Sam and I have it out on this. I don't know. Sam's, I don't want to, that's like asking me to pick a fight with my wife and put it on YouTube. I love Sam. I don't necessarily want to fight with him, but maybe we can have a good conversation. So anyway, my time's up. I've got, like I said, I'm doing some of you know, Andre knows, and Mark Lefevre knows who I'm talking to. I'm talking to John Vervaeke and this guy who made a video with Mark Lefevre for a while. I don't remember who he is. And then somebody else about, I don't know what we're talking about today, but John is in and I'm in. And so I don't know what channel it's going to come out on. And I don't know if they'll give it to me to put on my channel, but it'll come out on the YouTubes and we'll find it at some point. So that's what I'm doing at noon. And I almost never take Friday appointments because Friday afternoon is usually getting my video act together for the weekend. So including my
I believe you're speaking
sermon.
to Jules, and Jules
Yes.
is an incredibly lovely person. So
Yep,
I hope
that's
you
who it
enjoy the
is.
chat.
Well, I think we will. So anyway, so I've got to sign off now. So Rick and I can decide what we're going to do with some things, and then I'll be ready to go at noon with these other peeps. So thank you for your time and attention, and thank you for the super chats, and keep an eye out whether or not we'll do this next week or not. I don't know. So probably the week after is Thanksgiving, so I'll probably won't do it then either. So we might not have this for a few weeks. I'll just keep an eye on the channel and I'll let you know. All right, Rick, you can end transmission.